This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. As we approach the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, law professor F. Michael Higginbotham tells us about the subject of his new book, The Ghosts of Jim Crow. David Orentlicher, a lawyer, a doctor, a professor, and former state legislator, says the presidency is too powerful. Therefore, he argues, we need two presidents. And Bill Press talks with the new president of Americans United for Change, Brad Woodhouse. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. As the nation commemorates the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, we hear from African-American law professor F. Michael Higginbotham about the ghosts of Jim Crow. He says there's been much progress and that the destiny of today's black men and women will be determined by how hard they're willing to work. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, F. Michael Higginbotham, law professor at the University of Baltimore, specializing in constitutional law and human rights. He is the chair of the Maryland Attorney General's Task Force on Electronic Weapons, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the former chairperson of the Association of American Law Schools Committee on Recruitment and Retention of Minority Faculty. He is also the author of a new book called Ghosts of Jim Crow, Ending Racism in Post-Racial America. Professor Higginbotham, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be with you.
Why did you decide to write this book, and what is the intended audience?
I wrote the book for two reasons. One was to encourage, to really let all Americans know how much progress we've made, to remind Americans of the fact that we've ended slavery, we have ended Jim Crow segregation, we have passed anti-discrimination laws in housing and voting and employment, and we have implemented affirmative action programs in education. And we've also elected and reelected our first black president. And I think, that's tremendous progress. We need to really, I think, take pride in those accomplishments. But we also need to, of course, recognize that we haven't gotten to a post-racial society yet. So I wrote the book, one, to remind Americans of how much progress we've made, but two, to encourage Americans to finish the race, to encourage them to understand that while progress does not mean post-racial, post-racial is something that we definitely want to shoot for and that I think is achievable.
Is it too early to assess the impact of Barack Obama on the history and future of race relations in America?
I don't think it's too early. I think that there's already been a tremendous impact, and one of the most important impacts, I think, is reflective of the dreams and aspirations that minorities can have. The reality is that when you look at Obama and his success, that minorities can aspire to and can achieve the highest roles in American society, whether it's business or academia or politics. On the other hand, I think that there's another way, of course, to look at American progress, and that is to look at some of the socioeconomic disparities that exist in our society. So while Obama, I think, has had a tremendous impact in terms of people's aspirations and what they believe can be achieved, I think there's also a reality that, of course, it's not going to be that easy, and it's very difficult to make the changes in the disparities that exist, the widespread disparities that exist. Very difficult to make those changes, but those changes can occur as well.
What about the future of affirmative action? You've spoken pretty directly to audiences along the lines that blacks have to understand that some whites have been hurt by affirmative action. But, of course, many minorities have been hurt by legal discrimination in the past.
This affirmative action debate is a tough one, and I think it's important for everyone to identify what they're talking about when they talk about affirmative action, because a lot of people, it's apples and oranges. People are talking about one thing, and their listeners think they're talking about some other aspect of affirmative action. So there's actually a lot of agreement on a number of aspects of affirmative action. For example, no one or very few support quotas. Quotas were outlawed in Bakke, and I think very few folks support quotas for any voluntary program. I think many individuals, white, minority, support outreach programs, programs where they want to identify potential candidates for applying to schools or applying for jobs, and to bring those candidates in for interviews or for consideration. And so I think there's tremendous agreement on a lot of aspects of affirmative action. It gets very divisive, though, when you start talking about filling a particular job or filling particular seats in higher education. That's when people start to really disagree. And I think you see that disagreement manifested not only in debates about affirmative action, but also in terms of Supreme Court decisions, which are mostly 5-4 decisions where the justices are disagreeing about their definition of equality. And I think you really see that disagreement come out with the recent decisions, with the Fisher case as well as the Grutter decision and Gratz. You see those differences come out where the majority justices, who are basically attempting to limit affirmative action, those justices have a narrow view of what they mean by equality. Their view is basically that the Equal Protection Clause prohibits specific classifications that discriminate on the basis of race, that don't treat everyone the same. Whereas those with a more expansive view of our notion of equal protection look at access and opportunities and whether or not the result results in access and opportunities, creating additional access and opportunities. So I think you see that debate with the justices. You see it with the American people, and it is very divisive. And so I tried to talk about this aspect in the book by saying, when you have a long history of discriminatory treatment, and you're attempting to rectify, provide access and opportunity for groups that have been historically discriminated against, it's very difficult to provide those opportunities and at the same time to continue to have individuals view that as necessary the further and further you get away from the de jure discrimination, from the Jim Crow discrimination that was sanctioned by law.
We're speaking with University of Baltimore law professor Michael Higginbotham, also the author of the book Ghosts of Jim Crow, Ending Racism in Post-Racial America. Professor, what do you tell young African Americans about their roles and responsibilities in society?
Well, one, I tell them that their destiny is determinable by how much they're willing to work. I mean, how hard they're willing to work and how much they're willing to focus. Despite the fact that there may be additional obstacles for them because of their race or because of their economic status or because of some sort of disability, there may be obstacles that are greater for them than for others. But that doesn't mean that they should give up. That doesn't mean that they should turn to crime. That doesn't mean that they should join a gang. What it means is the opportunities are there if they're willing to take advantage of it. And the fact that there may be obstacles out there is not a reason to give up or an excuse for failure.
Okay. Michael Higginbotham, law professor at the University of Baltimore. The book is called Ghosts of Jim Crow, Ending Racism in Post-Racial America. Professor, I wish we had a lot more time to discuss more of this. I know we'll have another opportunity down the road, but want to thank you for taking some time with us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It was my pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you in the future.
Sounds good. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. A radical idea to rewrite the Constitution. Have a co-presidency held by two people of opposing parties. Law professor and former state legislator David Orentlicher lays out his reasoning. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The voters, damn them, have got to be subverted. You won't find that autocratic principle taught in any civics class, but it's one that America's corporate powers openly embrace when local democracy offends them. Just ask the voters of Orlando, Florida, who recently felt the sting of such arrogance. A grassroots coalition called Organize Now had collected 50,000 signatures last year to put an earned sick time referendum on their county's November ballot. It was to be a citizen's vote on whether employers should let workers earn a few days each year of paid leave to be used if they fall ill or must care for a sick family member. Whoa, shouted the bosses of Disney World, Olive Garden, Red Lobster, and other super-wealthy, low-wage corporations in Orlando that provide minimal or no benefits. We can't allow that. So they leaned on the county commissioners to knock the referendum off the ballot. However, the scrappy Organize Now bunch took them to court and won. The people's victory was too late for last year's election, though, so the court ordered that the referendum be put on the 2014 ballot. So, all set, right? Not so fast, shouted the corporate powers as they scuttled off to Tallahassee, demanding that the GOP governor and state legislative leaders deliver a, quote, kill shot to those pesky voters back in Orlando. Sure enough, the obsequious, corporate-hugging politicos obliged in June by enacting a brutish, democracy-smashing law called state preemption. It autocratically usurps the right of local governments and local voters to enact paid sick leave benefits. This is Jim Hightower saying, still, it's not over, for the corporate subversion of the people is not real popular and maybe not even legal. Organize Now is pushing back and pushing ahead. Keep up with them at www.orgnow.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. How can we end the political polarization gripping Washington? Professor David Orentlicher says the Constitution is to blame, and we need to have a co-presidency consisting of members of opposing parties. He says it would prevent bad decision-making, like Watergate and the invasion of Iraq. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, David Orentlicher is a constitutional law scholar at Indiana University, who has also taught at Princeton and the University of Chicago. He earned degrees in law and medicine at Harvard, and he has served in the Indiana state legislature. He is also the author of a provocative new book called Two Presidents Are Better Than One. David Orentlicher, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Indeed. Since the extreme partisanship in Washington has led to gridlock, you've come up with a solution that perhaps would shock many people, having two presidents instead of one. How would that improve things?
Well, that's a good question because you might worry if Democrats and Republicans fight bitterly in Congress, why put Democrats and Republicans in the White House and let them fight out there? But it would work, and here's why. What's really driving the partisan conflict, it's not really so much a phenomenon of Congress. That's really a symptom. The real problem is we have our presidency has evolved over time into an imperial presidency that has accumulated an immense amount of power. And we give that power to one person who represents one political party. So it's not surprising that we end up seeing Democrats and Republicans fighting bitterly to see who holds that power. So they spend all this money tearing each other apart for elections, and as soon as November 4th or 2nd passes, the next campaign begins, and Democrats try to block whatever Republicans are doing, and Republicans try to block whatever Democrats are doing, so that their hope is that they can gain more of the power at the next election. If you say to them, we're going to, instead of giving one party all of the executive power, we're going to require the two parties to share the power on a 50-50 basis, then they're going to have to work together. The only way they can get anything done is to work with the other side. And their desire, in the end, elected officials want to get things done. That's what their constituents want. And so by forcing people to share power, then they end up putting aside their differences.
We're going to lock you up in the sandbox until you make a decision. So now, seriously though, how would the elections work? I mean, does this mean getting rid of the Electoral College too?
Well, that's a good question. We would, in some ways, it wouldn't change. We'd still have the same primaries and caucuses and conventions for each party, Democrats, Republicans, and third parties as well, to nominate their presidential and vice presidential candidates. And then we'd all go to the polls in November and cast our single ballot. But instead of the top vote getter going to the White House as president and vice president, the top two vote getters, so we'd have two presidents and two vice presidents who would share the executive power. And it could be, ordinarily it would be a Democrat and a Republican, but sometimes you might get a strong third-party candidate like John Anderson in 1980, who came, if the polls showed even around the election that he had almost as much support as Jimmy Carter. But right now, third-party candidates can never run first because people are worried about squandering their vote and just creating a path for their least desired candidate. But if you like, say, Ralph Nader in 2000, and Nader didn't win, Al Gore would run second at least, and so it would be safer to run for third party. So you'd vote one vote. The top two vote getters would get in. We'd probably have to abandon the Electoral College because when electoral colleges are not very good at distinguishing between the second and third place candidates. So it'd probably be better to just have popular votes and the top two vote getters are the winners.
Well, that would have changed a lot of things in 2000. You mentioned you mentioned Ralph Nader and Al Gore, Electoral College, and all of that. But we love to bicker, we love to point fingers and blame people. How would the public know who to credit or blame for things with two presidents?
Well, that's important. You're right. Our system is essentially based on one of accountability to the voters, that we want to make sure that elected officials stand for election and re-election so the voters can decide who they want to run their government. And when you have two presidents, do you blame the Democrat, the Republican, or the independent if there's a third, somebody else? They would share, since they would share decision making, and decisions would be joint decisions. For the most part, they would stand or fall together. If people are happy with what they're doing, they would very likely re-elect both, and if they were unhappy, they would turn to other people and replace both. There may be times where one president drives things more than the other, even though they both agree one president might be viewed as more of the driving force. So it's possible that you might retain one and throw out the other. But for the most part, I think they'd stand and fall together, and I think that's okay. What we worry about is on who to credit or blame is sometimes it's not clear when, is it Congress or the president who's responsible? But when you've got two people sharing the executive power who are signing off together, then I think it's clear that they're jointly responsible, and I think that's fine.
Another issue, too, potentially, David, we're speaking with David Orentlicher, constitutional law scholar at Indiana University and author of the book, Two Presidents Are Better Than One. The cost, because now we're talking two presidents, two vice presidents, Secret Service protection, Air Force One, two Oval Offices, all those types of things. So how big a factor is that potentially?
Yeah, I think that's, in the big picture, not going to be a big concern, the fact that you have to double your resources, because in the total budget it's not very big. There's ample room in the White House, for example. I've looked at the blueprints, and is there enough working space and living space for two presidents? And in fact, there is. There wouldn't be as much guest quarters, and some of the supporting staff would have to move outside and join their colleagues, most of whom already work outside the White House. So I don't think that would be a problem. Then, presidents, what happens when they're in different parts of the country and there's a decision that has to be made urgently? Already the communications have to be established between the president and the military, the president and their advisors. So remember, George Bush was in a Florida classroom when 9/11 occurred, and
right.
He had to communicate with Washington. So we already have that issue about connecting the president with advisors, and just adding a second president wouldn't make anything more complicated.
In any of the country's recent elections, and I guess we'll kind of play a little game here, but let's look at, say, the last 50 or 60 years. Can you give us a scenario of who may have been good co-presidents and how things might have worked out for the better?
Yeah, there's some very good examples about how we would have been better off with co-presidents. Watergate in the 1970s that brought down Richard Nixon. If Hubert Humphrey had been Richard Nixon's co-president, we never would have had the Watergate debacle, and really it was a terrible constitutional crisis for the country. We wouldn't have had an Iraq war with George Bush and Al Gore. Even though there were a lot of Democrats who supported the Iraq war, Al Gore was on record before the intervention saying we should not do it. And the other part of it, not only wouldn't he have supported, but it's unlikely that if we had had a CIA overseen by a joint appointee of George Bush and Al Gore, that we would have had the misleading intelligence reports that made it possible to go into Iraq. So we would lose a lot of the bad decisions. A presidential partner would prevent the other person from making a bad decision, but we'd still get a lot of the good decisions. Like the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson, would he have been blocked by his partner? And it turns out I've looked up the record, and John Adams, who would have been his partner, supported him even though most of John Adams' Federalist Party counterparts in Congress opposed the Louisiana Purchase. John Adams himself supported it. And what we see is the reason why I'm confident that we'd lose a lot of the bad decisions but retain most of the good decisions is because people who study decision-making, the economists and psychologists, all come to the same conclusion that you want group decision-making, shared decision get better result than single decision-making, because you want people with different perspectives trying to solve our problems and coming up with solutions, and having one person with one perspective doing so. And that's what you'd get with presidential partners. When it comes to, economic regulation, you'd have the free market perspective and the regulatory perspective, and it's much better to get a balance of those two than just to have one side make all the decisions, because you get excesses. You get either free market excesses, or you get too much government regulation when one side calls the shots.
What do you think the chances are of getting your idea ratified? And especially in our lifetime, because I know there are probably a lot of people, especially with as divided as the country seems to be right now, and they would think, oh my gosh, you can't have two different presidents. That would just make things worse. But you're making a pretty good case here, and so I'm wondering sort of how do you feel? What sort of feedback have you gotten?
Well, as a state representative, I found that I spent 6 years in the Indiana House of Representatives, and I found that if you have a good idea, the question is not so much whether you can get it enacted, but how and when. And I think there are two important factors to getting to a two-person presidency. First, we haven't always had such high levels of partisan conflict. You go back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s. There was a lot more cooperation across party lines. And it really has gotten much worse in the past 10 or 20 years. And I think the public will need to see that the high levels of partisan conflict that we have aren't going to disappear unless we change our Constitution. And as long as we have an imperial presidency, we're going to have these high levels of partisan conflict. So I think that's the first thing, for people to realize this is not going away, and we need the problem is with the presidency. Second, the factor that's at stake here is preferences about the kind of leadership you have are to a large extent cultural. In the United States, we have strong preferences for the single, strong, decisive leader, and it's just not that way in other countries where shared leadership is much more common. Over time, cultural preferences change, as we're seeing now with views about same-sex marriage. So I think as younger generations come along, and I find when I talk about my idea that younger people are more receptive to it because they're not so tied to traditions. And so the two things I think coming together, the persistence of the partisan conflict and the willingness to rethink cultural traditions, I think will make it possible, even in our lifetime, to see a two-person presidency.
Okay. David Orentlicher, constitutional law scholar at Indiana University and the author of the book, Two Presidents Are Better Than One. David, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time and look forward to having you back here on americasdemocrats.org.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Brad Woodhouse, president of Americans United for Change.
Well, our last day on Current TV, we want to reach out and bring you some of our best friends and our best-looking friends here. Have their best last chance to be on Current TV, Bill, as well as all of our radio stations. Brad Woodhouse is one of them, former communications director of the DNC, and now he is the president of Americans United for Change. Mr. President, nice to see you this morning.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Tell us about Americans United for Change.
Well,
what are you up to? What do you do?
Folks may remember, may not, George Bush back about 8 years ago tried to privatize Social Security, and there was an organization started to defeat that. It was Americans United to Protect Social Security at the time, and it morphed into Americans United for Change. I ran it before I went to the DNC, and then they gave me the opportunity to come back, and we're fighting the progressive cause. Every single big issue that Democrats and progressives are pursuing this summer, this fall, this term of Congress, we're involved in.
And I know one of them is Obamacare.
Absolutely.
Which so the Republicans, first of all, they voted 40 times in the House to repeal it.
Right.
And now the big move, led by sort of nut jobs Ted Cruz in the Senate. And,
you said it, not me. I would have.
And Tom McClintock, whom I know is a certifiable nut job from California, in the House. They're saying, and in fact, we've got McClintock at a town hall meeting, Dan, right? Just I think it was yesterday in California. basically the argument they're making now is unless we defund Obamacare, we are going to shut down the government. Here's
I've told the House leadership, I will cut you a lot of slack on the appropriations bills. I understand they have to be reconciled with the Senate. This is a compromising process. They have to be approved by the president. I'll cut you slack on those. But I am not going to vote for any more continuing resolutions to simply kick that can down the road. Now, I will make one exception to that, and that is if we can get a provision in the continuing resolution that defunds Obamacare this year.
What? With all the good that is happening and people are benefiting from Obamacare, what is his passion for killing it and defunding it?
Well, look, I was on another program yesterday, and I said I think it's Obama derangement syndrome. I mean, these people hate any Obama, especially the Tea Party. We know John Boehner has just ceded his speakership. I mean, the man could just, could just not show up some days. He ceded the speakership to the Tea Party caucus. Whatever they want goes. That's why they voted 40 times to repeal Obamacare. Not one time bill to replace it, not one time to create jobs, not one time to deal with some of the president's jobs proposals, not one time to build bridges or roads. They can't even get the transportation bill, appropriations bill to the floor in the House because they're so radical. They're so radical over there. So, look, I'll say this. Have at it. We've done some polling with SEIU, or SEIU did some polling for our coalition and the people that are working on this. Every single time they talk about repeal, every time they bring repeal vote to the floor without anything to replace it, every time they talk about defund, Obamacare gets more popular. So you know what? Do it. When Heritage Action, Jim DeMint's group, came out and said, we're going to do town halls all around the country. We're going to rally for defunding Obamacare or shutting down the government. I sent out an email. I said, bring it on. The American people are getting the benefits. They're more and more going to start receiving the benefits October 1st, January 1st, and they're on the wrong side of history here. The American people want something done. Now, look, Obamacare as a proposition, yes or no, is about a 50-50 proposition. But all of those internal things, all of the things that are doing to benefit the American people, getting coverage even if you had a pre-existing condition, getting coverage on your parents' policies, getting cheaper prescription drugs. The American people like that stuff. You go ahead and keep talking about taking it away.
Yeah, the president at his news conference Friday, and I was there, he pointed out Republicans, it used to be repeal and replace.
Right.
They don't say the replace anymore, right?
They had repeal and replace for about a day. And then I think John Boehner and the Republicans realized that there's nothing that they could do to replace Obamacare that, one, would fix the problem, two, that would satisfy the insurance companies, which are lining their pockets, and that, three, that the Tea Party would go along with. So now all they have is just take Obamacare away, which is really a political argument. I mean, Obamacare is reducing the deficit. It's going to make people healthier. It's going to create jobs. It's going to help small businesses be competitive on the world stage because they're going to be able to provide health insurance to their employees. And Republicans want to take it away, I think, more than anything out of their zeal and hatred for Obama. Look, we've said it 1,000 times. This plan that was passed is not the plan that most progressives would have embraced wholeheartedly.
Right.
It was a plan that Heritage put on the table in the 1990s to defeat Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton's efforts to pass a more robust public plan for health care reform. And now they've turned. It was obviously what Romney passed in Massachusetts. So what explains their opposition to it? Obama.
And the president also pointed out that so the people who Obamacare has, it'll expand, I guess, starting October 1, really January 1, but you can buy into the health exchanges starting October 1.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So there'll be some 30 million more people who could be covered.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So the GOP passion, it seems to be, right, or their mission is to prevent those 30 million Americans from getting health insurance. Now, how is that? I don't understand how that's a message you can go out and sell. This is what I'm doing for you.
Right.
I'm preventing you from getting from buying your own health insurance.
And look, look, this is the
at a lower premiums than you could ever get it before.
That's right. Lower premiums in California, lower premiums in New York, lower premiums everywhere. We're creating more competition in the marketplace, which is an interesting thing. I mean, that's what Republicans have talked about for years. Hey, let's create competition in the marketplace, and that's what this does. And look, how do you explain it? I guess maybe all these gerrymandered districts in the House, and then in those districts, the most right-wing Republicans that have ever served in the Congress are looking over their shoulder at people who are more right-wing than them that may actually, God forbid, run against them in a primary. And those many of those are people who just don't like this president for whatever reason, because he's a Democrat or whatever else, because they don't believe he was born here, because they think he's a Muslim, or whatever their crazy reasons are. And look, some of these people, Bill, are saying, you know what, not only do I want to defund it, not only do I want to repeal it, they know that's a lost cause. They don't have the votes to do it. The president's not going to sign a bill to repeal his own law. They won't help their constituents get access to it.
Right. Yeah,
it's unbelievable. And I'll tell you what, one thing we found in our polling is that really hurts the Republican Party. So we're going to, look, I'll tell you one thing. We're going to send people into offices and say, hey, I want some help. I want some help signing up for Obamacare. Mm-hmm. And if they don't help, we're going to hold them out, and we're going to hold them up and say, that's not what you're elected to do. Some of these people don't like Social Security, but they still help their constituents get their Social Security checks if they're late or stuck in the mail or whatever else. They got to do the same for Obamacare.
Well, the other thing that I find very interesting, this threat to shut down the government. There are voices like Karl Rove and some others who are saying to the party, in fact, I think Newt Gingrich has even said this, who once did shut down the government. You guys ought to really think this through,
right?
And yet the crazies again are not listening to the wiser heads in their own party.
It's a shooting war, and look,
John McCain has said this is crazy.
John McCain has said it's crazy. Richard Burr, who's no one's progressive Republican, has said that it's crazy, and there's really a shooting war going on between Republicans over the strategy. In fact, there are three camps. I mean, they can't even. I mean, this is one of the things that's benefiting. Look, there's no doubt that Democrats are winning August. Republicans are getting killed. They don't have a strategy on Obamacare. They have the delayers, the defunders, and the repealers. They have three different camps. I mean, Governor Norquist came out last week and said, well, we're probably not going to repeal it. We're probably not going to defund it. Let's just delay it. Let's delay it all. As another way of a political bludgeon against the president. And then they're getting creamed in town hall meetings on immigration from our side. Look, if you can't get Republicans to come with you to see reason and evidence and intelligence, then you know what? Have them fighting with each other.
Yeah.
That's the next best thing.
We love it. Brad Woodhouse, love having you in studio, too. Join the conversation here at 866-55-PRESS. Republican disarray. I love that. Three camps arguing among themselves about Obamacare. Delay, defund, or repeal.
Right.
And some Republicans are saying, get off that and be for something rather than against everything. It's the Full Court Press, Thursday morning, August 15th.
Live on Free Speech TV, beginning September 3rd. Visit freespeech.org to learn more. This is The Bill Press Show.
Here we go, 13 minutes before the top of the hour. Brad Woodhouse, president of Americans United for Change. It's AmericansUnitedForChange.org. It's how you keep up with all the good stuff that they're doing on the progressive agenda around the country. Back to Brad and your comments and your calls in just a second. Meanwhile, here on the question of identity theft, always looking for articles in the news which remind us how widespread it is. This news out of Kentucky, chalk one up for the good guys, I guess. The long arm of the law has caught up with another person guilty of identity theft. She's a Kentucky woman admitted to stealing somebody else's identity to buy a car, sentenced to 39 months in federal prison. That risk of identity theft is everywhere unless you're protected against it, as I am with LifeLock Ultimate, the most comprehensive ID theft protection available. Even monitors your bank accounts from takeover fraud. But, of course, LifeLock services can't protect you or your bank account if you're not a member. Visit LifeLock.com or call and mention Press 10, and you'll get 10% off your LifeLock Ultimate membership. Call 1-800-356-5967. 1-800-356-5967 for LifeLock Ultimate. 1-800-356-5967. And Brad, our last day on Current TV, we've been reminding everybody that we are a radio show. We started as a radio show. We continue as a radio show. And our lifeblood, really, are the great affiliates around the country.
Well, that's why I'm here. I have a face made for radio.
There you go.
What do you think I got into this business?
Yeah. And we want to particularly salute all of our affiliates today. Let's say hello to WZLO up in Bangor, Maine. A lot of calls from Bangor, Maine. Appreciate hearing from them. And especially, one of the most powerful, and I think the best progressive radio stations in the entire country is WWKB up in Buffalo, New York. We've been up in Buffalo. Haven't been there for a while. We got to go back to Buffalo.
Yeah, let's get back to Buffalo.
That affiliate tour.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you like that? Yeah.
And WWKB is a signal that is one of the strongest signals. I mean, it comes down. You can hear it in Washington D.C. until a certain hour of the morning. Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, if we're going to go to Buffalo, we got to figure that out pretty soon because winter is coming. And
winter is probably in Buffalo.
That's true.
All of our good people up on the frontier in the Buffalo area. Salute, and thank you. Peter.
On that note, by the way, we're still tweeting. No matter what happens, we're always tweeting at BP Show.
Yes.
At BP Show. We're going to be on Free Speech TV. We're going to be on Talker.tv. And comment from Black Cat, one of our good friends, says, my favorite news show. This is, watching you, this is where I first learned how to tweet. Don't worry, Bill. I know where you're going. I'll find you. All my best. So that
he learned that from Bill?
Yeah, from our show. I mean, he signed up to.
Well, there you go.
To tweet with us on the show.
That's great. That's great. So, you're leading the revolution.
We have an impact here,
that's
Brad.
right.
I want you to know. Yeah.
And on Obamacare, Aria says, I guess calling it Obamacare sounds more evil to the Republicans than actually calling it the Affordable Care Act, which is the actual name.
Which it's kind of backfired because they started calling Obamacare right prejudicially, right?
Yeah,
whatever.
That's
then the president adopted it and said, yeah, you can call it Obamacare. I'm proud of that.
Obamacare.
That's right. Well, here's the thing is that, it's an interesting story. Back when I was at the DNC, one of the first, when Tim Kaine was there, he was passionate about that. He's like, you know what? Let's call it Obamacare. And they didn't make the pivot at the time. He's like, let's call it Obamacare because Obama does care. And it's perfect because, 10 years from now, this thing is going to have 70% support. Yeah. And the Republicans are going to start calling it the Affordable Care Act. Or something else. Because they don't want, they're going to be, oh, God. ACA. They don't want it to be associated with the Democratic president at that point,
So on this threatening to shut down the government of Obamacare, you've seen some polls on it. The American people, what do they feel about? As I say, they do shut the government down. Who gets the blame?
Look, we've been here. We've seen this before. They're without question, the Republicans will get the blame. First of all, they don't have a strategy for even talking about it. They're fighting with one another. Some of their older time leaders, like John McCain, are saying that the notion is absolutely crazy, that it'll hurt the Republican Party, that it'll cost them a house. Some of the conservative commentators out there are even saying the same thing. Former Republican consultants like Karl Rove are saying the same thing. So one, they're not speaking with the same voice, and that means that the president, the bully pulpit that he has, will eviscerate them. Now, look, I don't want the government to shut down because it will really hurt people. It'll hurt our economy. It will cost us jobs. It will inconvenience the American people. Now, you could just be kind of a cold-hearted political strategist and say, go do it. Mm-hmm. Do it, because it will further erode the support that you have. Independents are leaving you in droves. Hispanics don't want to have anything to do with you. Women, particularly single women, don't want to have anything to do with you. Blacks have never want to have anything to do with you since you started trying to restrict their voting rights and so forth. So, have at it if that's what you want. But that's not what we want. I mean, we're happy to have this battle, happy to have them talk about it. It's strengthening Obamacare every day that they talk about repeal or defund. But shutting the government down is got to be the most irresponsible thing that anybody elected to public office could ever entertain. It is ludicrous.
So the field troops for the progressive agenda around the country, Americans United for Change. They got a great new president. Here he is, Brad Woodhouse. Follow their good work. Join up. Join the forces, right? You need
absolutely.
More foot soldiers out there.
We're in 10 states right now with Protect Your Care doing healthcare work, and we're going to follow heritage around the country and say, bring it on.
So check them out at AmericansUnitedForChange.org. Thanks, Brad. Great to see you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. F. Michael Higginbotham, David Orentlicher, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to America's